You can tell the moment friendship starts becoming love because silence suddenly feels louder than words. Every Saturday at exactly 7:30 in the morning, Nolan Whitaker's dusty green SUV rolled into the parking lot outside Landon Mercer's apartment with the same familiar double honk that somehow sounded more like a greeting than a car horn ever should. Landon never needed to check the time anymore. His camera bag was already waiting by the front door, his hiking boots were tied, and a travel mug of black coffee steamed gently in his hand before Nolan even stepped out of the driver's seat. 6 years of friendship had quietly turned routines into instincts. Nolan leaned against the hood wearing another faded baseball cap that had probably seen more mountain trails than most people ever would. "You ready, slowpoke?" he called with the same grin that somehow made every early morning feel less offensive. Landon rolled his eyes while locking his apartment. "You always ask like I've ever said no. One day you might. Not before you stop bringing those cinnamon rolls." Nolan lifted the small paper bag with exaggerated pride. "Exactly the answer I expected." They laughed, climbed into the SUV, and headed toward another trail somewhere beyond the city where highways slowly surrendered to pine forests and winding roads. Nolan always drove. Landon always controlled the playlist. It had never been discussed. Somehow it had simply become another rule neither of them questioned. Friends developed habits like rivers carved valleys. Little by little, without anyone noticing. By the time they reached the trailhead, the morning sunlight filtered through tall evergreens in soft golden stripes that stretched across the dirt path. Landon instinctively reached for his camera before taking more than 3 steps. A pair of deer disappeared into the trees. Morning mist drifted above the valley like slow-moving waves. Nolan waited patiently, without saying a word. He always did. "You know," Landon muttered while adjusting his lens, "most people would complain about stopping every 5 minutes." Nolan shrugged. "Most people aren't hiking with my favorite photographer." Landon laughed awkwardly and looked back through the viewfinder before Nolan could notice the unexpected warmth creeping into his face. Compliments from strangers were easy. Compliments from Nolan somehow lingered longer. The climb became steeper after the first mile. As always, Nolan quietly slowed his pace until they walked side by side. He never rushed ahead. He never acted impatient. Whenever the trail narrowed beside loose gravel, Nolan naturally shifted to the outside edge without making a show of it. Whenever Landon paused to catch another photo, Nolan simply admired the scenery or skipped stones across a nearby creek. It happened so naturally that Landon had stopped recognizing it as kindness years ago. It was just Nolan being Nolan. Around noon, they reached an overlook where endless green ridges stretched toward the horizon beneath an impossibly blue sky. Landon lowered his camera for once. "Funny," he said softly. "I've photographed this place dozens of times." Nolan sat beside him on a weathered log. "Still can't capture what it actually feels like." Landon smiled. "Something like that." A comfortable silence settled between them, interrupted only by distant birdsong and the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. Nolan broke off a piece of his sandwich and looked toward the mountains instead of at Landon. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." Nolan hesitated longer than usual. "If someday I stop asking you to hike with me every weekend." He finally turned, his expression calmer than his voice. "Promise you'll come looking for me." Landon chuckled, expecting another joke, but Nolan didn't laugh. For the first time all morning, the mountain air felt strangely still. The question stayed with Landon all the way home, settling somewhere in the back of his mind like a pebble inside a hiking boot that was too small to ignore but not painful enough to stop walking. Nolan acted completely normal during the drive back, singing badly to old rock songs on the radio, laughing whenever Landon threatened to change the station, and stopping at the same roadside diner where they always ordered burgers and shared an oversized basket of fries because Nolan insisted that food tasted better stolen from someone else's plate. By Monday morning, the strange conversation on the mountain should have faded, yet Landon caught himself replaying it while editing wildlife photographs in his small home studio. "Promise you will come looking for me." It did not sound dramatic anymore. It sounded oddly sincere. The following Saturday arrived with another familiar double honk outside his apartment. Landon smiled before he even realized he was smiling. He grabbed his backpack and hurried downstairs faster than usual. Nolan noticed immediately. "Look who is actually early for once." Landon shrugged. "Maybe you are rubbing off on me." That is the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me. Their destination this time was a state park nearly 90 miles away, famous for waterfalls hidden deep inside old hardwood forests. The trail stretched almost 7 miles round trip, winding over wooden bridges and gentle ridges where sunlight flickered through maple leaves like scattered gold coins. Nolan naturally reached for Landon's backpack when they crossed a narrow stream. It will be easier if I carry this for a minute. You carried it last weekend too. I know. Then let me carry yours. Nolan laughed. Mine is all the snacks. You would complain after 10 minutes. Landon rolled his eyes, but accepted the exchange without arguing further. Somewhere along the trail, he realized something uncomfortable. Nolan always noticed the little things before anyone else did. If Landon looked tired, Nolan slowed down without mentioning it. If Landon admired a scenic overlook for longer than expected, Nolan quietly waited instead of checking his watch. When chilly wind rolled across the ridge, Nolan casually offered an extra flannel shirt from his backpack, as though he had packed it for himself. Maybe he had. Maybe he had not. Landon had never asked. They reached the waterfall shortly after noon, where dozens of hikers gathered along smooth rocks to eat lunch and take photographs. Landon lifted his camera, searching for the perfect angle, but his attention drifted away from the rushing water almost immediately. Through the viewfinder, he found Nolan instead. Nolan was kneeling beside a little boy whose shoelace had come undone, patiently tying it while the child's embarrassed father thanked him. A few minutes later, Nolan helped an older couple figure out which trail would take them back to the parking lot. He did everything so naturally that it almost disappeared into the background, as though kindness required no audience. Landon lowered the camera without pressing the shutter. Strange, he thought. I spend every weekend chasing beautiful landscapes, but somehow the person I keep noticing is standing right beside me. Nolan looked over and waved. Did you get the shot? Landon hesitated for half a second before answering with a smile that surprised even himself. Not the one I expected. The photograph haunted Landon far longer than he expected, not because he had captured it, but because he had not. Every image he edited during the following week looked technically perfect, yet somehow incomplete. Towering pines stood exactly where they should. Sunlight spilled across rivers in warm ribbons. Hawks soared through cloudless skies. Everything was sharp, balanced, and beautifully framed. Still, his mind kept wandering back to Nolan smiling beside the waterfall instead of any landscape stored on his memory cards. Saturday arrived quietly. There was no familiar double honk outside his apartment. Landon glanced at the clock. 7:32. Maybe traffic. He poured another cup of coffee and opened one of his photography magazines. 7:46. His phone remained silent. By 8:15, he checked the weather, convincing himself heavy traffic or road construction had delayed Nolan. At 8:30, he finally picked up his phone, only to stop with his thumb hovering over Nolan's name. He had never been the one to call first on hiking days. Somehow, Nolan always reached out before he had the chance. It felt strangely awkward to interrupt a routine that had lasted for years. He set the phone down. 5 minutes later, he picked it up again, then put it back. By late morning, he had reorganized his camera lenses twice, watered every plant in his apartment, and cleaned a kitchen that had not needed cleaning. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the silent screen resting on the coffee table. It was ridiculous. Nolan was probably busy. People had lives outside weekend hikes. They were adults, not teenagers waiting for invitations to hang out. Landon repeated those thoughts so many times they began sounding less like logic and more like excuses. Shortly after 1 o'clock, he finally received a message. Sorry, got caught up helping at the rehabilitation clinic this morning. Long story. Rain check? Relief arrived so quickly, it almost embarrassed him. He answered with a casual, no problem. Hope everything is okay. Talk later. Then he stared at the conversation, wondering why 2 simple sentences had instantly made the apartment feel brighter. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Without thinking too much about it, Landon grabbed his backpack, loaded his camera into the truck, and drove toward their favorite state park anyway. The familiar trail welcomed him with rustling leaves and crisp autumn air, yet every step felt strangely out of rhythm. He instinctively slowed near steep sections, expecting Nolan to catch up beside him before remembering he was alone. At the overlook where they usually stopped for lunch, Landon sat on the weathered log, overlooking endless ridges fading into the horizon. The silence sounded different today. Not peaceful. Empty. Families laughed somewhere below. A golden retriever bounded happily across the trail, chasing fallen leaves. Two older friends debated which direction led back to the parking lot. Everyone seemed to have someone walking beside them. Landon pulled out the extra turkey sandwich he had packed that morning without realizing he had made two. He laughed quietly at himself before shaking his head. "You really are losing it," he muttered. The breeze carried his words away almost instantly. For the first time since he had met Nolan 6 years earlier, Landon admitted something he had been avoiding for weeks. He did not miss hiking. He missed the person who had quietly become part of every trail, every overlook, every conversation, and somehow every peaceful corner of his life. The realization settled over him as gently as the afternoon sunlight. Impossible to deny once it finally arrived. Somewhere between thousands of footsteps and countless weekends, his favorite destination had never been the mountains. It had always been Nolan. The following Saturday, the familiar double honk returned before the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops. Landon was already standing by the window with his backpack over one shoulder, pretending he had not been watching the parking lot for the last 10 minutes. He walked downstairs trying to look casual, but the relief on his face appeared before he could hide it. Nolan climbed out of the sport utility vehicle wearing the same easy smile that had always made ordinary mornings feel lighter. "I owe you an apology," Nolan said as soon as Landon reached him. "The clinic had an unexpected emergency last weekend. Everybody stayed late." Landon forced a shrug that he hoped looked effortless. "It happens. You are not mad." "Should I be?" Nolan laughed. "Good. I was worried you would replace me with somebody who hikes faster." "Not a chance." The words escaped before Landon could soften them. Nolan smiled for a brief second, then opened the passenger door. Their destination was a mountain preserve about 80 miles north, famous for colorful fall foliage and panoramic overlooks. The drive felt comfortably familiar until Nolan cleared his throat halfway there. "There is someone joining us today." Landon turned his head. "Someone?" "A co-worker from the clinic. She keeps saying she wants to start hiking, but has never gone. I figured today would be a good beginner trail." Before Landon could answer, they pulled into the parking lot where a woman in a navy windbreaker waved enthusiastically beside her compact sedan. "You must be Landon," she said with an easy smile after Nolan introduced them. "I am Claire Bennett." "Nice to meet you." Landon returned the greeting politely, but something inside him shifted ever so slightly. The trail began gently, weaving through brilliant orange maples and towering oaks. Claire asked Nolan endless questions about physical therapy, marathon training, and the best local coffee shops. Nolan answered every one with his usual warmth, laughing often. Enough that the sound echoed through the quiet forest. Landon stayed close behind them, pretending to photograph mushrooms growing along fallen logs whenever their conversation drifted beyond him. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Nolan was allowed to have friends outside of their weekend tradition. He was allowed to invite people. He was allowed to laugh with someone else. Every one of those thoughts sounded perfectly reasonable until Claire reached for Nolan's arm while stepping over a muddy patch in the trail. It lasted only a second. Nolan barely seemed to notice. Yet Landon felt something unexpectedly heavy settle in his chest. He lowered his camera without taking the picture he had lined up. The forest suddenly looked less vibrant than it had only minutes earlier. Around lunchtime, they reached a scenic overlook where rolling hills stretched for miles beneath a clear autumn sky. Claire wandered toward the observation railing, admiring the view. Nolan unpacked sandwiches from his backpack, then looked around in confusion. "Where's Landon?" Claire pointed toward a quiet path leading away from the overlook. "I think he kept walking." Nolan spotted him standing alone beneath a cluster of golden aspens, staring through his camera without pressing the shutter. He approached slowly. "You found something worth photographing?" Landon kept his eyes on the lens for another moment before lowering it with a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I thought I did." Nolan studied him carefully. "You have barely spoken all morning." "I am just tired." Nolan nodded, but the concern in his expression remained. For the rest of the hike, he quietly adjusted his pace until he was walking beside Landon again, just as he always had. Somehow that simple gesture only made the confusion in Landon's heart grow stronger. because he could no longer tell whether he was afraid of losing his best friend or terrified that he already wanted something far more than friendship. By early afternoon, the bright blue sky had quietly disappeared behind thick gray clouds that rolled across the mountain ridge with surprising speed. Nolan looked up, his relaxed expression turning thoughtful. That forecast changed fast. Claire followed his gaze. Do we still have plenty of time to get back? Nolan checked the trail map on his phone before slipping it into his pocket. If we keep moving, yes. But we should not stop too long. A cool breeze swept through the trees, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. Leaves that had danced lazily only minutes earlier now fluttered wildly across the path. Landon tightened the straps on his backpack and instinctively reached for the rain cover protecting his camera. Photography could wait. Getting down the mountain suddenly felt much more important. They had barely covered another mile when the first drops began tapping softly against the forest floor. Within minutes, the gentle shower became steady rain. The dirt trail darkened beneath their boots, tree branches shimmered with water, and distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the surrounding hills. Nolan immediately pointed toward a small emergency shelter marked on the park map. There is an old ranger cabin less than half a mile ahead. We will wait there until this passes. Nobody argued. The three of them picked up their pace, weaving carefully between slick rocks and puddles until a weathered wooden cabin appeared through the rain. It was small, simple, and clearly built for unexpected weather rather than comfort. But the roof was solid and the porch offered welcome relief from the steady downpour. Inside, two rough wooden benches lined the walls beside a stone fireplace that had not been used in some time. Rain drummed steadily against the roof while cool air slipped through narrow gaps around the windows. Claire rubbed her hands together with a nervous laugh. Well, this definitely counts as an adventure. Nolan smiled reassuringly. Mountain weather likes to remind everyone who is really in charge. He pulled 3 emergency blankets from his backpack, handing one to Claire before unfolding another toward Landon without hesitation. Here, I am fine, Landon replied automatically. Nolan raised one eyebrow. Your hands are freezing. Landon looked down. Nolan was right. He had not even noticed. He accepted the blanket with a quiet thank you while Nolan unpacked a small thermos. Still warm, Nolan announced proudly after pouring hot coffee into 3 reusable cups. Claire laughed. Do you prepare for every possible situation? Almost. Nolan grinned. Landon once forgot lunch on a 12-mile hike. I learned my lesson. Landon shook his head, smiling despite himself. You are never letting that story die, are you? Absolutely not. The rain continued falling harder, surrounding the cabin with a soft curtain of gray. For a while nobody spoke very much. Claire read a trail guide she found on the shelf, while Nolan quietly watched the weather through the window. Landon found himself watching Nolan instead. The calm way he handled unexpected problems. The thoughtful way he always packed extra supplies without making anyone feel unprepared. The quiet confidence that somehow made every difficult situation seem manageable. Nolan suddenly turned, catching Landon looking at him. Everything okay? Landon blinked, startled. Yes, just thinking. About. Landon hesitated before offering the safest answer he could find. How you always seem ready for everything. Nolan chuckled softly and looked back toward the rain. Not everything. His voice carried a strange weight that lingered beneath the steady rhythm of raindrops. Outside, thunder faded farther into the distance, but inside the little cabin another kind of storm quietly continued growing, one neither of them seemed ready to name. The rain softened into a gentle drizzle, but none of them seemed eager to leave the quiet shelter just yet. Claire stretched her legs and wandered toward a bulletin board covered with faded trail maps and handwritten notes left by hikers over the years. Nolan busied himself repacking the backpacks with the same careful efficiency he always seemed to have, making sure every zipper was closed and every water bottle was secure. Landon watched him in silence, still hearing those 2 simple words echoing in his mind. Not everything. Somehow they explained nothing and yet felt important. Claire turned back toward them holding a weathered guest book she had found tucked beneath the window. People have been signing this for almost 20 years, she said with a smile as she flipped through the pages. Some of these messages are actually pretty sweet. Nolan laughed. You are definitely the kind of person who reads every plaque at a national park. Absolutely. Hidden stories are the best part. She continued reading until something caught her attention. Wait a second. Her eyes moved from the page to Nolan with obvious curiosity. This cannot be the same Landon, can it? Landon looked up. What do you mean? Claire held the book open. About 3 years ago, someone signed this after finishing the ridge loop. The note says, finally convinced Landon to come outside again. One hike down. Hopefully 100 more. Landon's smile disappeared. He looked at Nolan, who suddenly became very interested in adjusting the straps on his backpack. Claire blinked between them. That was you. Nolan let out a quiet sigh before giving a small nod. I forgot I wrote that. Landon frowned slightly. What are you talking about? Nolan hesitated, then rested against the wooden wall with an expression Landon had rarely seen, one that mixed nervousness with quiet honesty. Do you remember after you left your office job? Landon nodded slowly. You barely answered messages. You stopped taking photography trips. Half the time you ignored my calls. Every time I invited you somewhere, you found an excuse to stay home. Landon looked down without speaking. He remembered those months more clearly than he wanted to. Everything had felt heavy back then, even getting out of bed some mornings. Nolan continued gently. One Saturday, I stopped asking whether you wanted to go hiking. I just showed up outside your apartment. A small smile crossed his face. You complained for 20 minutes during the drive. Claire laughed quietly. I can actually picture that. Nolan smiled too. He said bugs hated him personally and mountains were overrated. Even Landon could not help laughing. I really said that. Several times. Nolan's smile softened. But halfway through the hike, you took out your camera for the first time in months. Silence settled comfortably between them again. Outside, sunlight slowly pushed through thinning clouds, turning raindrops on the surrounding trees into tiny flashes of gold. Nolan looked toward the window before speaking one last time. After that, I kept inviting you every weekend because every trail gave you a little more of yourself back. Landon felt something tighten gently inside his chest. All this time he had believed the hikes were simply a shared hobby. He had never imagined they had started as an act of quiet care from someone who refused to let him disappear into loneliness. Looking at Nolan now, standing only a few feet away with that familiar calm expression, Landon realized the most beautiful thing he had found in all these years outdoors had never been hidden in the forests or waiting at the top of a mountain. It had been walking beside him from the very beginning. The storm finally drifted east, leaving the forest washed clean beneath a pale afternoon sky. Tiny drops still clung to every branch, sparkling whenever sunlight slipped through the opening clouds. The trail back toward the parking area felt quieter than before, not because anyone had run out of things to say, but because each of them seemed to be carrying private thoughts that deserved a little silence. Claire walked several yards ahead, happily pointing out colorful mushrooms and bright red cardinals that darted between the trees. Behind her, Landon and Nolan followed at their familiar pace, their boots crunching softly over damp leaves. Landon kept replaying Nolan's confession inside his head. Every weekend, every invitation, every trail, none of it had been accidental. Nolan had never asked for credit. He had simply kept showing up. The realization made every shared memory look different, as though someone had quietly adjusted the focus on an old photograph. They reached a narrow section where the path curved along a rocky hillside overlooking a shallow valley below. Rain had left the stone unusually slick. Nolan glanced toward Landon almost automatically. Take this part slowly. Landon smiled faintly. You say that every single time. Because you never listen every single time. Claire laughed from ahead. I think he has a point. Landon shook his head with amused surrender and stepped carefully onto the smooth rock. For a few moments, everything felt perfectly ordinary again. Then the sole of his boot slid unexpectedly across the wet surface. It was not a dramatic fall, only a sudden loss of balance that made his stomach lurch before he could react. Instantly, a steady hand closed around his wrist. Nolan had reached him before the surprise even fully registered. Got you, Nolan said quietly. Landon looked up. Their eyes met only inches apart. Neither of them spoke. Nolan did not immediately let go. His grip was firm but gentle, reassuring rather than urgent. Landon realized he was still holding on just as tightly. The forest seemed to fade into soft background noise. Wind whispered through the trees. Water dripped rhythmically from the branches. Somewhere farther down the trail, Claire politely pretended to be fascinated by a wooden trail marker, giving them more privacy than either of them had requested. Nolan finally smiled, though it carried an unfamiliar vulnerability. You okay? Landon nodded, but his voice arrived almost a second late. Yes. Neither hand moved. For one suspended moment, neither of them seemed willing to be the first person to let go. Landon suddenly understood that what frightened him was not slippery rocks or mountain trails. It was the possibility that one careless step could change the friendship that had quietly become the safest place in his life. Nolan slowly loosened his grip, though his fingers lingered for the briefest instant before slipping away. They continued walking side by side, closer than before, neither mentioning what had happened. Yet something invisible had shifted between them. Their conversations became softer. Their shoulders occasionally brushed along the narrow trail, without either person stepping away. When they reached the parking lot, Claire thanked them both for the unforgettable day before driving home with a cheerful wave. Landon and Nolan remained beside the sport utility vehicle for another quiet minute, watching golden evening light settle across the distant hills. Nolan broke the silence with a gentle smile. Same time next Saturday? Landon looked toward the mountains one more time before meeting Nolan's eyes. This time his answer came without hesitation. I would not miss it for anything. The next Saturday arrived wrapped in crisp autumn air and a sky so clear it looked freshly painted. Nolan greeted Landon with the familiar double honk, but instead of turning toward one of their usual parks, he drove west along quiet country roads that neither of them had traveled before. Landon glanced out the window, recognizing less and less of the landscape with every passing mile. Where are we going? He asked. Nolan smiled without taking his eyes off the road. Trust me, that answer usually means I should be worried. Not this time. They reached a small trailhead tucked between towering pines just after 8 o'clock. There were only 3 other vehicles in the parking lot, and a wooden sign welcomed hikers to an overlook that required nearly 4 miles of steady climbing. Nolan adjusted his backpack before handing Landon a bottle of water. No camera today. Landon looked down at his empty hands. He had not even noticed until that moment. You told me to leave it at home? Nolan nodded. Just for once. Landon laughed softly. You are asking a wildlife photographer to hike without a camera. Exactly. The climb was peaceful. Fallen leaves rustled beneath their boots while cool mountain air carried the scent of cedar and damp earth. Without stopping every few minutes for photographs, they reached the summit much sooner than either of them expected. The overlook stretched before them like an endless ocean of rolling hills painted in gold, crimson, and deep evergreen. Wind drifted gently across the ridge, carrying nothing except the distant calls of birds gliding through the valley below. Nolan rested his backpack on a flat boulder and quietly sat beside it. Do you remember the first mountain we climbed together? He asked. Landon smiled. I complained the entire way. You absolutely did. I also got poison ivy. Nolan laughed. You blamed the forest personally. They both laughed until the sound faded naturally into another comfortable silence. This one felt different. It no longer carried uncertainty. It simply waited. Nolan drew a slow breath before speaking again. There is a reason I wanted to come here. Landon turned toward him. Nolan looked out across the mountains instead of meeting his eyes. That first hike changed something for me too. His voice remained calm, but quieter than usual. At first I only wanted to help my best friend smile again. Somewhere along the way I started looking forward to every Saturday more than I should have. He paused, searching for words with unusual care. I kept telling myself it was enough just to walk beside you. I never wanted to risk losing what we already had. Landon felt his heartbeat quicken in the gentle silence. Nolan finally looked at him, honesty replacing every trace of hesitation. I think I have been carrying feelings that grew into something deeper than friendship a long time ago. The words settled softly between them, carried away by the breeze instead of weighing heavily on the moment. Landon lowered his gaze for only a second before smiling in quiet disbelief. I spent weeks trying to convince myself that I was only afraid of losing my best friend. He shook his head gently. Then I realized that was never the real problem. Nolan waited without interrupting. The real problem, Landon continued, was realizing I wanted every weekend after that to begin exactly the same way. Your truck outside my apartment. Your terrible singing. Your terrible jokes. Every trail. Every conversation. I was never chasing another mountain. His smile grew warmer. I was always hoping it would be you waiting at the trailhead. Nolan's eyes softened with unmistakable relief. Neither of them rushed the moment. There were no dramatic speeches, no impossible promises. Only two lifelong friends quietly choosing to stop pretending that what had been growing between them was still ordinary. Surrounded by endless ridges glowing beneath the afternoon sun, they understood that the destination they had both been searching for had never been marked on any map. Several months passed, and Saturday mornings still began with the same familiar double honk outside Landon's apartment. Some traditions, they discovered, did not need to disappear when life changed. They only became more meaningful. Landon no longer rushed to grab every camera lens he owned before leaving home. Sometimes he still packed his equipment when a new trail promised rare wildlife or breathtaking landscapes. Other weekends he left it behind without a second thought, knowing that not every beautiful memory needed to be captured through glass. Nolan teased him about it every single time. "Who are you? And what have you done with the photographer who used to stop every 50 feet? Landon laughed as he climbed into the sport utility vehicle. He finally figured out that some moments look better when you are actually living them. Nolan grinned, started the engine, and turned up another playlist full of songs neither of them could sing particularly well. The mountains welcomed them through every changing season. Autumn slowly surrendered to winter, when quiet forests sparkled beneath fresh snow and every breath became a cloud drifting into the cold morning air. Winter eventually softened into spring, bringing rushing streams, blooming wildflowers, and endless shades of green stretching across familiar hillsides. Every trail seemed different, yet somehow every weekend still felt comfortably like coming home. Claire joined them again from time to time, always pretending she had never noticed the quiet change between them even though her knowing smile suggested otherwise. One afternoon she shook her head while watching them debate which trail to explore next. "You two spent years hiking side by side before realizing everyone else could already see what was happening." Landon looked toward Nolan with an embarrassed laugh. "Apparently, we were the last people to notice." Nolan shrugged playfully. "We are not known for being fast learners." Their laughter echoed across the overlook, blending naturally with birdsong carried on the breeze. One bright spring morning they returned to the very first trail Nolan had convinced Landon to hike years earlier. The path looked smaller now, almost familiar enough to feel like an old friend. The same wooden bridge crossed the narrow creek. The same overlook waited at the top of the final climb. Even the weather seemed determined to remember them, wrapping the mountains in warm sunshine and clear blue skies. Landon stood quietly at the overlook, taking in the endless ridges stretching toward the horizon. This time he finally raised his camera. Nolan smiled. "Found the perfect view?" Landon adjusted the focus, then slowly turned the camera away from the mountains and pointed it toward the person standing beside him. Nolan laughed in surprise. "Pretty sure I am blocking the scenery." "Exactly," Landon replied. "That is the point." He pressed the shutter once. The photograph that appeared on the screen showed Nolan smiling naturally beneath the morning sun, surrounded by distant peaks glowing in soft light. It was not the most dramatic landscape Landon had ever seen. It did not feature rare wildlife or extraordinary weather. Yet somehow it instantly became his favorite photograph. Because for the first time, the image finally captured what every mountain had been quietly trying to teach him all along. Adventures were never measured by miles walked, summits reached, or photographs collected. They were measured by the people who chose to keep walking beside you, even when the trail became uncertain. As they began the hike back down, Nolan reached over and gently intertwined his fingers with Landon's. It felt so natural that neither of them commented on it. They simply continued forward together, following the winding path beneath towering trees, smiling at the familiar sound of boots against the trail, already looking forward to the next Saturday morning, the next mountain, and every ordinary weekend that had quietly become the greatest journey of their lives.